We are regaining our focus, refocusing on the things that we might be doing anyway, but maybe sometimes we forget why we're doing, what our goal is, what's the point. And I want us to sharpen that focus for a few minutes this morning, throughout the day today, and then again tomorrow morning as we gather together. I just want you to leave this weekend refreshed, refocused, rededicated, feeling as if you've been renewed by again coming to the feet of Jesus and again saying, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. This is where I'm headed. And so this morning I want us to do that by talking about parenting and the idea of parents and their relationship with their children as we see it presented by a certain example in Scripture. Hebrews 11 and verse 23 says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So the Hebrew writer is talking about the great deeds that have been accomplished through faith, and he calls our attention to Moses. But the story of Moses doesn't start with Moses. You notice that in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. The story of Moses' faith and everything that Moses is going to accomplish through his faith begins with his parents' faith. It begins with his parents making a decision to trust God and to put their child in God's hands. And through that faith came all of these wonderful things that Moses did by his faith. The faith of these two people, Amram and Jochebed, became the faith of Moses, and through Moses affected so many people, became the faith of the children of Israel. So, what I want us to see is that for these two Jewish parents, Amram and Jochebed, their faith was not limited to what they believed about God, their service to God. This is what I think, this is what we believe. But instead they said, when we believe something, we are going to try to share that and live by that in our parenting. And through that, they changed the world. So I want to spend some time talking about Amram and Jochebed because I believe we relate pretty well to their situation. What is amazing about the story of Moses and his parents is that Moses and his parents lived in a time that was truly horrible in terms of raising children, lived in a time where there was so much to be afraid of, lived in a time where the likelihood of them passing their faith on to the next generation was so small. And we relate to some of that. We, like them, when we look at our world, have tremendous concern. It concerns us to raise parents in the time in which we live, to raise children. We don't raise parents. I don't think that happens. To raise children in the time in which we live. We want to communicate our faith to the next generation. We want our kids to know what we have learned about Jesus. We want them to be able to go through the difficulties of life and come out on the other side with an intact faith. That's what we want. And yet we are concerned because we see our world and we know the dangers of the world and we know the people in the world and we know that the likelihood of that, well, it's a dicey proposition. It's a hard thing to do. And so I want to see if we can't learn something from these godly parents about how you and I can succeed in raising children to know the Lord even in a time like ours. So, well, you didn't see that, did you? No, we got a little ahead of the game there, but we're not ready for that. So I want us to go to the book of Exodus chapter 1 to begin with. Exodus chapter 1. We're going to just look through this story for a few minutes this morning and see what we can learn from Amram and Jochebed and their example. So, Exodus chapter 1, the scene is Egypt. Remember, the descendants of Jacob have come down to Egypt because of Joseph, and they have become enslaved there by people who did not know Joseph. And so, the threat to the children of Israel is that they are going to be kept in bondage, and through that, the Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, is going to even take more extreme measures to try to oppress the people and to hold them down. So, Exodus 1 and verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So drown all the baby boys in the Nile. Probably this was a population control thing. Probably also this is about minimizing the possibility of revolt. Because if we can limit the number of men, maybe we can just sort of keep them subjugated for a little while longer. And then in chapter 2 and verse 1 it says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months." Now this is not Amram and Jochebed's first child. We actually know that they have 2 other children. They're going to play into the story. They have Aaron, who is about 3 years older, and they have a daughter named Miriam, who is a little bit older than Moses. But it appears that this is the first child after the king's edict. So can you imagine, parents? You have a child, and the first thing you do is hide them. That's the first thing you do. You don't take pictures and send them out on Facebook. "Hey, everybody, here's the birth announcement. Congrats." No. Let's not have any announcing. We don't want anybody to know that we've had a child. So, what I want to say to begin with is just that Moses was born in a difficult time. It's hard for me to imagine a more difficult time. When there is an immediate threat to your child's life. As soon as they are born, you have to hide them because the king, the most powerful man in the world, who also thinks he is a god, he wants your child dead. And so immediately she must hide the child. She is going directly against the command of the king. Immediately she is showing her faith in God and her love for her child. So what would you do in a situation like that? What would you do if that was your kid? You have a child, you're enslaved, people want to kill the child. The king wants your child dead, and there are probably people who would rat you out to the king easily without any problem or trouble. So she does something that is an amazing act of faith. In verse 3, Exodus 2 verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, just think about the idea, how long can you hide a little baby? They get to be 3 months or 6 months. I mean, parents of young children, they don't just stay quiet, right? Okay? When she could hide him no longer, it says, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds at the riverbank, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. So here you have, she puts the child in the reeds. This is not, as I've sometimes seen portrayed, that she puts the basket into the river and just says, well, let's hope for the best. Okay, this is instead, she puts it in the reeds so that nobody would see it, probably so she could come back later and get the child out. So probably there's some immediate pressure that says, I've just got to get him out of the house so that nobody will know. And Miriam is watching. Some have suggested that she even sort of ironically fulfills the command to cast the baby boys into the Nile. She does cast them into the Nile, but she's going to get him back. In verse 5, Exodus 2 and verse 5, now the daughter of Pharaoh came to the bathe at the river, and while her young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. So this is a big deal. This is the daughter of Pharaoh, and she sees the basket. She's going to find out what the Hebrew woman has done. This is a time for prayer because more than likely she's going to say, Dad wanted this kid dead, so kill it. Verse 6, when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So she has pity. Miriam is right there to say, I know somebody who can take care of the child. And Jochebed is going to end up getting her baby boy back, and she's going to not only raise him, she's going to get paid to do it. So God blesses and takes care of this family because they have faith that he will help. They resisted the king's command. They were more afraid to do something wrong than they were afraid to follow the king. These are pressures no parent would want for their kid, right? Are you volunteering to raise your kids in this time? And yet, Amram and Jochebed have to raise kids in this time because that's the time they live in. They don't have any choice. It's not as if they could say, you know what, when everything is better, when we finally get out of slavery, you know, when things calm down, there's not so much civil strife, or maybe when the king lifts his edict to kill all the baby boys, then we'll have kids. They have to raise children in the time in which they live. That's the only time there is. We share their concern. It's a scary thing to live in the time in which we live, and it is hard to watch the circumstances in which we live. It is hard to watch as there is growing acceptance in our culture of sexual behaviors that the Bible condemns, that we don't want our children involved in. It is hard to watch the climate of our culture in which the Bible is viewed with a sort of dismissive disdain. when people who follow the Bible are called hypocrites, and the one that really shocks me is they are called hateful, people who follow a Savior who preaches love. It is hard to watch the acceptance and defense of destructive behaviors and the pressure that is put on people of faith in our time. It is hard to watch. And it is hard to look at that situation and say, I want to bring an innocent child into a world like this. Because we know what the world does to people in its best forms. And as we see it growing worse, we are concerned. But the thing is, this is the world in which we'll raise children because there's no other world. This is the time in which we'll raise children because we don't get to live in another time. This is our time. So we are like Amram and Jochebed. This is where we are. This is where we'll stand. And this is the world in which we must be prepared to do what must be done to raise our children. What Amram and Jochebed show us is that it's still possible to communicate faith in really hard times. And we need that reassurance when we are concerned. They did it in more difficult times than the ones we face, and they show us we can too. Part of what they show us is that as parents, it is our job as much as is possible to protect our children from the dangers of our world. There will be a time when they have to stand on their own, when they will face those things for themselves. But like Amram and Jochebed, there is also a time in which our job is to insulate them from these pressures and dangers. And so they show us that's something we can achieve, even though the dangers are quite difficult. Second, Moses only had a short time at home. Look in verse 10 with me, Exodus 2 and verse 10. So Moses goes home with his mom, and it says in verse 10, when the child grew older. And that word grew older is interesting. It's a very vague word. It can mean that an infant has reached boyhood or even manhood. So we're probably talking about a time of just a few years. It says, when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So she has a few months, years, we're not even sure. She has a short time with him at home before she must take him back to Pharaoh's daughter, present him to Pharaoh's daughter. And it seems to me that Jochebed knew that time is coming. There's a deadline. So anything I'm going to teach this baby, anything is going to have to happen now. Can you imagine the focus that produces? When I know that I'm going to have to send my child off to be in the palace, I better get done what needs to be done. And what is impressive to me is that as Moses is then raised in Pharaoh's house, he has a tremendous sense of his identity as a Hebrew. Look at verse 11. Exodus 2 and verse 11. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out to his people. He looked on their burdens. He went out to his people and he looked on their burdens. This is not, I am just the prince of Egypt, and oh, who are these slaves? These are my people, and they are burdened. And in fact, it affects him so much that he acts in a way that is quite rash, and he kills a man. Now, where did Moses get that sense that he is a Hebrew? These are his people. Their burdens. This shouldn't be happening. There is an injustice here. I have a very hard time believing that happened at the feet of Pharaoh's daughter. That began at home. Moses had a sense of identity that began in those few years between when he was in that basket and when he went into Pharaoh's house. Turn the page to Exodus 3. In Exodus 3, when God appears to Moses in the desert later in his life, Exodus 3 and verse 6, in the burning bush, it says, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Verse 15, God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. What's interesting is Moses doesn't hear that and say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Who are you? God of the Hebrews? Who? Now, you talk about Abraham and Isaac. Who are those people? I don't even know who that is. Are you Ra, Sekhmet, Osiris? Like which one of those? I know those gods because that's how I was raised. No, he He embraces the idea that he is a Hebrew, there is a God of the Hebrews, that these are the descendants, his ancestors, because Moses knew who he was. So here's what I'm getting at. As you look at that period of Moses' life, it seems to me that his parents must have felt such urgency. And I believe we can relate to that as parents. We have an urgency to our task because we know that there is only a short time that we have with our children in which they are impressionable in the way that they are as children. Someone has likened raising children to wet cement because there is a time when you can work with the cement, and then there is a time when it is what it is. Someone has likened raising children to a tree that as it's young, as it's a sapling, as it's growing up, you can bend it and twist it to make it and grow into the direction that you want it to grow. But at some point, the tree's growing how the tree wants to grow. And so it is with our children. We know that there are times where we can impress on them a sense of identity and character. This is who you are. This is how you live. This is what it means to serve God and to live for God. But there is an urgency to that because we also know there will be a time when they will pick their own friends and they will pick their own morality and they will have the self-control they want to have. And so it appears to me that there is encouragement to be taken here from Amram and Jochebed because they instill in that short window an identity that sticks with Moses for the rest of his life. And I especially want to talk about that. Identity, to me, is a key of what we are trying to give to our children. This is who you are. Our children don't come into the world knowing who they are. They must be taught. They must learn who they are. And as parents, it is our privilege to say, you are the creation of God. You are a child of God. You are a servant of God. So that wherever they go, that identity sticks with them. Whatever career path they choose, whatever place they choose to live, however their family life turns out, they always know, this is who I am. Moses had a lot of struggles in his life, but Moses always knew he was a Hebrew. His mama taught him that. And so it is with our children, that we must impress those lessons of identity and character in that short window that we have. What Amram and Jochebed show us is you can stamp your children when they are young with a stamp that never goes away. That can be bad, but they show us that can be so good because it helps their son for the rest of his life. Third thing I want us to see here is that Moses had dangerous influences. In Exodus 2, back in chapter 2 and verse 10, Exodus 2 and verse 10, it says, when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So he is raised in the house of Pharaoh. Pharaoh, who was praised and served as a god. He is, if you'll excuse the expression, in the heart of the beast. I can't imagine a worse place for a young boy completely alone to grow up, because there are dangerous influences all around. We don't have to speculate about that. We actually have some information about that. This is Acts 7 and verse 22, where Stephen is talking about Moses. It says, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. We often worry about the education of our children, don't we? What are they being taught? Is it true? Are they being fed lies? Is it something that has an agenda behind it? What are people trying to get my kids to believe and understand? I'm not sure it could get worse than in the house of Pharaoh, instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. We're not talking biblical wisdom here. We're talking about the wisdom of a godless people. We worry about our education. I remember, and I attended, as you guys know, Texas A&M University, which I believe to be a fairly conservative university, if that's not an oxymoron. And I remember professors at our university in Western civilization classes, in history classes, and in religion classes, deliberately setting out with the agenda of trying to ridicule my faith, to undermine my faith. Do you really believe that? How could anybody believe? Look at this. Think about this. As if it was a game to them. We worry about the education of our children. We wonder, are they going to be able to stand up to that? Will they have faith when they reach that point to be able to stand on their own, because we know and we have seen and we still see to this day the power influences have to change minds and to rip faith out of people. Moses had that. Moses had influences that would have ridiculed everything his parents taught him, everything about those stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And yet something happened that insulated him and developed faith in him that stood up in spite of those influences. There is also the fear, as parents, we have of how our kids are going to live. You know, are my kids going to grow up spoiled? Am I giving them too much? Are my kids going to become the kind of people who don't value a dollar or don't know how to work? They don't have responsibility and don't know how to handle responsibility. Can you imagine what Moses' parents must have worried about? This is what is said of Moses, Hebrews 11:24, we read earlier. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. There are a couple of phrases there, I underlined them. One is the idea of being called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That is status. What door in Egypt is closed to the son of Pharaoh's daughter? I don't know if that's a ring. I don't know if they gave him an ID card. Whatever it is, there's no door closed to Moses. He goes where he wants to go. Everyone bows when Moses comes to town. He has status. And then there is this reference, just in passing, to the treasures of Egypt. What could Moses not have had he wanted it? If he wanted women, if he wanted money, he wanted food, whatever he wanted to put his feet up, never work a day in his life, he could have done it. But do you notice what the text is saying? In spite of all of that, Moses chose different. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Instead, he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God. He considered the reproach of Christ greater riches than the riches and the treasures of Egypt. So something happened that helped him to withstand those influences. We worry about influences on our kids, don't we? We know what influence can do. We've seen it. It's happened to us. We know we've done stuff we shouldn't have done because we were influenced by people we shouldn't have been influenced by. And so when we see our kids hanging around with people that they shouldn't be hanging around with, we worry. We worry about what's going to happen when we send them off to school. We worry about how are they going to handle situations that maybe tripped us up when we were younger. I imagine that Amram and Jochebed would surely have wanted Moses to grow up with different influences. But what they show us is that it is possible to raise men and women of faith even when there are evil influences around. It's possible. I know because they did it. Now, that doesn't mean, please don't take that to mean, that we shouldn't care, that we shouldn't try to influence that and try to help our children to get the evil influences out of their lives. I am saying we all know that there is a point at which children are going to have the influences that they choose. Our job is to give them the identity and the character while we have that opportunity that will help them to withstand those influences. And the fourth thing I want us to see here is that Moses needed to grow. Look in Exodus 2 and verse 11 with me. Exodus 2 and verse 11. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together, and they said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So Moses acts impulsively here. He murders an Egyptian. He should not have done this. But he seems surprised by the reaction, that when people hear about it, they're a little bit afraid of him and a little bit cocky against him. So Moses runs. And he runs for his life out to Midian. We have a little more information about this. Again, this is from Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7. Stephen says he supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. You know why Moses killed that Egyptian? He thought it's time for the revolution, and I'm starting it. I mean, I'm the son of Pharaoh's daughter. I'm the Hebrew raised in the palace, and it's time for us to get out of here and rise up against our oppressors. He thought his brothers would understand that God was delivering them, but they didn't. Please understand that Moses' action was an act of faith. Now, I don't say that to justify. It's a murder. But I'm saying that's what Moses was thinking. Have you ever had an act of faith where you did something and you thought, you know what, I'm just going to try it and throw it out there, and then it just didn't work? Maybe you said, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say something about what I believe, and maybe somebody will be convinced and converted. Maybe somebody will respect me because of that. And you try it and then nothing happens. Or maybe it all blows up in your face. That's what Moses felt. And when you have that experience, you get a little bit burned, right? You're a little bit timid after that. Moses needed to grow. That's what's happening here. And so, Moses goes out to the desert, lives in the desert for 40 years in the land of Midian. Now just imagine if you are Amram and Jochebed. Here you had this baby boy, you hit him, you put him in the reeds, Pharaoh's daughter finds him, you're terrified and then you're rejoicing. Okay, he's going to live. And then you wonder the whole time, maybe you worry as he grows up. Then when he hits 40, he kills somebody. I don't know exactly how long Amram and Jochebed lived as relates to Moses. We know that Amram died when he was 137 years old. But to know that for the next 40 years, all that work you did, all those sacrifices you made, all those things where you thought, I wonder if God's at work in this, it just seems to come to nothing. Instead, your son is in exile because he's a murderer. That's what you know. Imagine how you would feel as a parent. You might feel like you'd failed him. But the truth is, Moses needed to grow. So Moses lives in the desert for 40 years, and it changes Moses. Do you know how I know that? We're not going to go into this reading this morning, but I'll refer you to Exodus 3 and 4. In Exodus 3 and 4 is when God appears to Moses in the burning bush. And have you noticed how reluctant Moses is to go? We usually talk about that section by talking about Moses' excuses, because he has a lot of excuses. And he's talking about, I can't talk well, and please send somebody else, and all of that. The way I read that, Moses is not ready to go because the last time Moses led the people out of Egypt, nobody followed. And so he says, I'm not your guy. I'm a desert guy. I'm a Bedouin. Get somebody else. Moses has changed. He has grown. In fact, Moses has grown in a different way than we might sometimes think. He grows from impulsivity and pride. He grows to humility and carefulness. He is no longer ambitious. Instead, he is humble. In fact, he's later going to be called the most humble man on the earth. Moses needed to grow. He wasn't that way at 40, but he was there at 80. And in fact, at that point, he was finally ready for God to use him. What seems neat to me is that it's very likely that Amram and Jochebed lived long enough to see their son come back with their other son, Aaron, and to lead the people out. And finally, they can see, can you imagine what it would be like as parents to see for all the roller coaster of parenting, you get to the end and you say, wow, God was in this whole thing. From the beginning, through the middle, through the desert 40 years, through all the plagues, and now leading the people to the promised land. The reason I bring this up is Amram and Jochebed remind me so much of parents that I talk to on a regular basis, parents of children who are worried about the choices their kids are making. Parents who are worried as their kids go off to college. Parents who are worried as their kids choose someone to marry. Parents who are worried as their kids are having influences in their lives. They begin to have moral struggles. And those parents are concerned. And I think about the heartache that these two parents, Amram and Jochebed, must have gone through, because I see that heartache reflected in the parents that speak to me about it. Now, I want to say, none of those things, the idea of making bad choices, the idea of struggling with our faith, the idea of marrying somebody who's going to be bad for us, none of those things are okay. It wasn't okay for Moses to kill someone. But what I want to say is there is a broader perspective that we need to have as parents that says our children are going to go through a process of growth, just like we have. And that process of growth is going to be hard to watch for a parent. Because we're going to see everything they should do and don't, and everything they shouldn't do and do. And we're going to want to make all their choices for them, because we really would do a better job. I'm talking to you, my children. But we need the patience to say, that child must grow. And I'm not here to say that every story like this ends up like Moses did. We know that's not true. There's sometimes children make these choices and they don't come back. But I am saying that if we can take the longer view, it may help us give peace and to persistently work to try to bring our children toward the identity that we have instilled in them from the beginning. Just because they haven't figured it out yet doesn't mean they won't. Remember, Moses figured it out when he was 80. Took a long time. So give your children room to grow. So, the story of Moses is amazing to me because his parents passed on faith to him in a difficult time. And I want to say we can do that too. I want to talk to you for just a moment about some of the how. Look with me in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. These are the words later in his life as he is leading the people into the promised land that Moses is going to say to the people about their responsibility toward their children. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children and shall talk of them when you sit down in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates." In the beginning of this, he says in verse 5, you shall love the Lord your God. That parenting must begin. The kind of parenting we're talking about, where we lead our children toward the Lord, must begin with me loving the Lord. It begins here. In fact, the greatest thing you can do for your children is love the Lord yourself. They will see, they will know whether what you're doing is real or fake. Whether this is just a weekend hobby that you have. Hey, we had to go to church because for some reason Dad thought that was important. Or whether this is coming from your heart. You shall love the Lord. And then you pass on that love. He talks then about how then you teach it to your children. Those words are on your heart, verse 6. Verse 7, teach them diligently to your children. Talk of them when you sit in your house and walk by the way, lie down, and when you rise. Talk to your kids about your faith. We talk to our kids all the time. We talk about their friends and their activities and their video games and all the things that they're into. Talk to your kids about your faith. Talk to your kids about the Bible and what the Bible teaches. Talk to your kids about your faith. This is the time when we can articulate the difficulty of faith. Faith is not just a straight road. You do it and you believe it. It says it, I believe it, and that's it. We have ups and downs in our faith. And I can say to my children, I really struggled with this. Here's how I got over it. Here is something that helped me. This is a hard thing to work through. Can I talk to you about it? You want to talk about it once a week where we keep working through. But one way or another, I want to share with them and show them that faith is not a straight line, but you can see how faith works by looking at me. That's the idea here. Talk of it all the time. There is never a time when it is inappropriate to talk to your children about the Lord and about the way of the Lord. Talk to your kids and instill in them that sense This is who we are as a family and who you are. As they age, share with them. As those moments transition into adolescence and adulthood, share with them what a blessing faith has been to you. How good people have been. You know, sometimes we can be awfully negative, and we communicate negativity to our children. When we criticize everything about what's going on in the church, then what we inevitably say is, well, church is bad. Talk positively, talk about blessing, share those things with your kids. And develop godly character. It's interesting to me, we talk a lot about, with our kids, we talk about their activities and their schooling and all the things that they're involved in. Sometimes when we talk to others, that's what we default to. You know, well, so-and-so's playing soccer and they're into baseball. Don't forget, what matters most about your children is not what sports they play or what grades they make. What matters is who they are, how they act. Have those conversations with your children. How do we treat people? How do we show kindness? How do we reach out to people who are left out? How do we forgive somebody when they hurt our feelings? Plant the seeds in those conversations of what faith and character are going to look like. Keep praying for them. Don't ever quit. I know that we have some in our audience, been parents a lot longer than me. Some in our audience who have kids who have wandered away from the Lord. Don't stop praying for them. Don't stop talking about it. If you have opportunities, that's who you are. Why would that change? What I'm trying to say, if I were to just sum it up in one idea, is that we often think that what we should do to pave the way for our children is that we need them to be born in a great time and in a great situation. And we just want to run interference for them in every way. And what Amram and Jochebed show us is that's not what gets them where they need to go. Maybe the bigger gift we can give our children than just having them be born in perfect circumstances and live their entire lives in a rose-strewn path is to give them the faith and the identity to withstand whatever will face them. And we can do that in any era. Would you pray with me about that? Our God and Father, we are so thankful to you for times like these that we can open your word together. We're thankful, Father, that you have left us examples like these of people who have done what we're trying to do, to raise children, to become believers, and to follow you. Father, I ask a blessing on all the parents here as we try to focus ourselves on the goal of passing our faith on. And Father, I pray that you will give us the opportunities that we need and the courage we need to seize those opportunities so that we can talk to our kids and we can instill this kind of character and faith in them. I ask, Father, that you will protect them from evil influences that would lead them astray, that would harm them. I ask, Father, that you will give us as parents, you would give us patience and the endurance that we need to see our task through to the very end. I ask, Father, that you will give us wisdom as we make choices about what's best for our children, that you will help us to understand that there are deeper things and higher priorities than the things that the world gives us. And I pray, Father, that you will help us to trust you in our parenting. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Might be someone here this morning who needs to respond in some way. We're going to sing a song of invitation so that if you have a need to be right with God or something that you need to confess to this group of brothers and sisters in Christ, if there is a need that you have, you can make that known and we can help you to be right with God. We don't want to close our service without extending that opportunity. So if there is anyone here and we can help you in some way, please come to the front right now as we stand and sing.